Welcome to LGBT Stories, your go-to channel for emotional, romantic, and sometimes heart-wrenching tales from the LGBT community. In today's story, we dive into a summer that changed everything for one young man. A hidden moment of closeness drew him and his uncle together in ways he couldn't have foreseen, blurring the line between loyalty and longing. This is a story of discovery, secrets, and a powerful connection that can change our lives forever. Stay tuned as we unravel this unforgettable journey. One hidden moment of closeness drew us together in ways I couldn't have foreseen, blurring the line between loyalty and longing in ways that would change everything. That summer is still vivid in my memory. Long, hot days in a town where time seemed to pause. We filled those days with bike rides along deserted roads, sneaking snacks from the fridge, and waiting for the sky to slip into that deep purple dusk. But this story isn't about just any summer day. It all began with my uncle's voice, quiet and inviting, carrying a secret he promised would make things interesting for both of us. He wasn't my uncle by blood, more of a family friend who I'd grown up calling uncle. He was a little older than the other adults around, with a mysterious air and a kind of charm that always made him seem larger than life. There was something about him that made people hang on to his words, and I wasn't immune to it. In fact, I was probably more under his spell than anyone else. One evening, he found me lounging on the back porch, fiddling with an old book I'd picked up to pass the time. He sat down next to me, looking thoughtful. "You're looking bored," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "There's just not much to do around here." He chuckled, a sound that felt warm and inviting. "Well, maybe you're looking in the wrong places." He leaned closer, and his voice dropped. "I've got something in mind, something that'll shake things up, but it's not for everyone. Only someone I can trust." I felt a thrill shoot through me, excitement mixed with curiosity. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my heart was starting to pound. He just smiled, a knowing look in his eyes, and gestured for me to follow him. I didn't even think twice. I got up and trailed after him out into the yard and toward the woods that bordered our property. It felt surreal, the world around us fading as we walked deeper. I had this strange sense that I was about to see things differently, as if I'd been handed a pair of glasses that would change my view of everything. We stopped near an old tree, its roots curling like fingers into the ground, holding secrets I'd never imagined. My uncle looked back at me, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as if gauging my reaction. "Promise you won't tell anyone," he said, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "I promise," I replied, barely able to keep the excitement from my voice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that glinted in the fading light. It was a small silver key, worn and ancient-looking. He handed it to me, and I took it carefully, feeling the cool metal against my palm. "What's this?" I asked, my mind racing. "It's to a place I haven't shown anyone," he replied, his eyes fixed on me, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And if you're up for it, I'll take you there." A part of me wondered if this was all some elaborate prank, but he looked so serious, so intent, that I couldn't help but believe him. I nodded, feeling a thrill of excitement. He took my hand and led me back toward the house, then down a small path that I'd always assumed led nowhere. We walked in silence, the sounds of the forest wrapping around us, until we reached a small, forgotten-looking shed hidden by trees. He stopped in front of it and looked at me with that same knowing smile. "Remember," he said softly, "you promised." I nodded, holding my breath as he pushed the door open. Inside, the space was small and filled with the scent of old wood and something else, a mix of oil and metal. He flicked on a small light, and I could see the inside of the shed for the first time. Tools hung on the walls, some rusted and others shining as if freshly cleaned. And there, in the middle of the room, was a workbench with scattered blueprints and notes, the kind of setup you'd expect in an old movie or a spy novel. "This is where I come to think," he said, his voice almost reverent as he looked around, "and where I work on projects that don't always see the light of day." I stared, unable to hide my amazement. The air felt charged with possibility, as if this place held secrets waiting to be uncovered. What kind of projects? I asked, curiosity winning over caution. He smiled, picking up a pair of safety goggles from the bench and handing them to me. Let's just say it's a mix of everything. Engineering, a little bit of science, and a lot of creativity. As I took the goggles, I felt like I'd been handed a piece of something larger than myself. A doorway into a world I'd never imagined. And as the evening faded into night, he began showing me his projects, explaining each one in detail. His voice was full of pride and enthusiasm. He showed me a small motor he'd built from scratch, a contraption he'd designed to collect rainwater, and even an old, half-finished radio that crackled to life when he turned it on. Each project was more fascinating than the last, and I found myself captivated by his world, drawn into his passion and dedication. Time slipped away as he shared his stories, and I felt like I was part of something incredible, something secret and powerful. But even as he spoke, I could tell there was more, something he wasn't saying, a hidden layer just beneath the surface. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of discovering something profound, something that would change the way I saw him and maybe myself. And as he leaned back, looking at me with that same enigmatic smile, he said, "But that's only the beginning. There's more, if you're up for it." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words, knowing that I was stepping into something bigger than either of us. I couldn't have known then what that night would lead to, or how it would shape the summer that followed. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a game or a simple adventure. It was a journey, and I was all in. The following days felt like a fever dream. Every afternoon, I'd wait for my uncle to call or give me a sign that it was time to go back to the shed, but he always kept me guessing. It was like he knew how much the mystery was driving me crazy, how much I craved the thrill of uncovering another secret. My mind kept racing back to that place. The flickering light, the hum of machines, and the look in his eyes like he was sharing something forbidden. When he finally asked me to join him again, I felt a surge of excitement mixed with something else, something that made my stomach twist with both anticipation and nerves. I told myself it was just curiosity, but deep down, I sensed there was more to it. I didn't have the words to explain it, but the air felt charged with something I couldn't quite name, a feeling that was both thrilling and unsettling. This time, when we walked to the shed, he was quiet, his face set in a serious expression. It was as if he had something on his mind, something heavy that he was holding back. We reached the shed, and he opened the door, gesturing for me to step inside. As soon as I entered, I noticed that the setup looked different. Things were rearranged, the bench cleared of its usual clutter. It was like he'd been preparing for something. "Today's a bit different," he said, his voice low. "I want to show you something special." I looked at him, trying to read his expression, but his face was unreadable. He moved over to the workbench and picked up a small metal box, the kind that looked like it belonged to a spy movie. He opened it, revealing a collection of old keys, each one unique and worn. They looked like they held stories of their own, as if they'd seen places and doors I'd never even dreamed of. "These are keys to places I used to go when I was younger," he said, holding one of them up. "Places that don't exist anymore. They're part of my past, and each one has a story." He handed me one of the keys, a small brass one with intricate engravings along its edge. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, wondering what doors it had opened and what secrets it held. As I looked up, I caught him watching me, his gaze intense. "What happened to those places?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a sad smile that seemed to carry years of memories. "They were special, but like everything, they changed or disappeared. You can't hold on to things forever, even if you want to. Sometimes you have to let them go." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. But something about his tone left me feeling uneasy. It was like he was telling me something more, something hidden beneath his words. We sat there in silence, and I could feel the tension building, a sense that we were on the edge of something big, something that would either pull us closer or push us apart. After a moment, he reached into the box and took out another key, larger and darker, with a rough texture that made it feel ancient. He held it up between us, his expression unreadable. "This one," he said slowly, is the key to a place I only visit in my mind, a place where memories live, where they stay safe. He handed it to me, and as I took it, I felt a strange connection, like I was holding a part of him that he'd never shared with anyone else. It was like a bond, silent but powerful, something that went beyond words. He looked at me, his eyes searching, and for a moment, I felt like I could see straight into his thoughts, like he was silently inviting me into his world. What if you could visit it for real? I asked, surprised at the boldness of my own words. He laughed softly, a sound that was both comforting and unsettling. Maybe some things are better left in the past, he replied, but there was a glint in his eye, a spark that told me he was just as intrigued as I was. The days that followed were filled with the kind of tension that lingered in the air, an unspoken understanding that something was shifting between us. We spent hours in the shed, talking about his projects, his past, and the dreams he'd had when he was younger. Each conversation seemed to peel back another layer, revealing parts of him I'd never known, parts that felt both familiar and completely foreign. There was one evening, though, that stood out, a night when the air felt different, charged with an energy that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. We were sitting on the floor of the shed, surrounded by blueprints and tools, our shoulders barely touching. He was telling me about a road trip he'd taken years ago, a journey that had changed him in ways he still couldn't explain. I think that's when I realized that life doesn't wait for anyone, he said, his voice soft and almost reflective. You either take risks or you end up standing still, watching as everything passes you by. His words hit me hard, resonating in a way I hadn't expected. I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name, a longing to understand the world the way he did, to see things with the same depth and intensity. It was like he was opening a door, inviting me to step into a reality that was both thrilling and terrifying. What kind of risks did you take? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He looked at me, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, the kind that most people wouldn't understand. The kind that leave a mark, a memory that stays with you no matter how much time passes, he replied, his gaze steady. The kind that leave a mark. His words hung in the air. I could feel my heart racing, a mix of excitement and nerves that left me breathless. It was like I was standing on the edge of something vast, something that stretched beyond the confines of that small shed, reaching into a world I'd only glimpsed in stories and dreams. The connection between us felt stronger now, an unspoken bond that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. It was a silent agreement, a shared understanding that we were on the verge of something that would change us both. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I was ready to follow him, no matter the risks. But as the days passed, I could sense a tension building, a feeling that we were approaching a breaking point. It was like a storm gathering on the horizon, a force that neither of us could ignore. Each moment felt charged with a silent intensity, a current that pulled us closer even as it threatened to tear us apart. There was one evening when he seemed distant, lost in thought. I watched him, wondering what was going through his mind, feeling a pang of worry mixed with something else, something that felt dangerously close to longing. He looked at me, his eyes holding a hint of sadness, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something to break the silence that had grown between us. But he just shook his head, as if deciding against it, and stood up, gesturing for me to follow him. We walked back to the house in silence, the night air cool against my skin. I felt a strange sense of anticipation, like we were on the edge of a cliff, waiting for something to pull us over. And then, just as we reached the back porch, he paused, turned to face me. His expression was serious, his eyes searching mine. "Remember what I said about risks?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, my heart pounding, not trusting myself to speak. He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze intense, and I felt a shiver run through me, a thrill mixed with fear and excitement. Sometimes the biggest risk is letting yourself feel something you don't understand, he said softly, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. And with that, he turned and walked into the house, leaving me standing there, breathless and unsure of what had just happened. The tension was electric, a current that left me reeling, and I knew that whatever came next, it was only the beginning. The days that followed felt heavier, each moment packed with unspoken words and a palpable tension building between us that I couldn't quite name. Every interaction felt charged, our words laced with double meanings, our silences stretching longer, almost unbearable. I found myself replaying his words, trying to decipher their hidden meaning, wondering if he felt the same pull, the same inexplicable connection that had taken root in my mind. One late afternoon, he suggested we go for a drive beyond the familiar paths and into the winding roads toward the hills. I didn't ask questions. I just got in the car, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. As we drove, the world around us blurred, the scenery slipping by as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that danced along the road. We didn't talk much. The silence between us was comfortable yet tense, a quiet anticipation hanging in the air. Eventually, he pulled off the main road, turning onto a narrow, hidden path that led to a secluded overlook, a place that felt untouched by the world around it. We stepped out of the car, the cool evening air brushing against my skin. For a moment, we just stood there, taking in the view. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape. And in that moment, everything felt surreal, like we'd stepped into a world all our own. He glanced at me, a small smile playing on his lips, and I felt my heart skip. The unspoken tension between us was suddenly impossible to ignore. Without thinking, I reached out my hand, brushing against his. He didn't pull away. Instead, he looked down at our hands, a flicker of something passing across his face. I could feel the warmth of his skin, a connection that felt deeper than anything I'd ever known. My mind raced, a million thoughts swirling, but I pushed them aside, focusing on the moment, on the way his touch seemed to steady me, grounding me in something real. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence stretching out, charged with possibilities. And then, almost imperceptibly, he leaned closer, his gaze intense, his eyes searching mine. I held my breath, caught between anticipation and uncertainty. The air was thick with an unspoken understanding that neither of us dared to voice. The next moment, everything seemed to slow down. His face was inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. I could feel the weight of the moment, a mix of fear and excitement that left me breathless. And then, without a word, he closed the distance. His lips brushed mine in a kiss that was tentative, gentle, as if testing the waters, feeling the boundaries of this new, uncharted territory. The kiss was brief, a fleeting moment that felt both too short and impossibly long, a spark that left me reeling. He pulled back, his expression a mix of emotions I couldn't quite place. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. "I shouldn't have," he started, his voice barely more than a whisper. But I shook my head, cutting him off. "It's okay," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. I wanted it too. He seemed to relax, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. And I felt a surge of relief, a sense that we'd crossed a line but somehow found ourselves on the same side. The tension that had been building between us for weeks felt like it had finally broken, replaced by something softer, something that felt both new and familiar. We sat there in the fading light, the silence between us now comfortable, our breaths synchronized as we took in the moment. It felt surreal, like we'd slipped into a different world, a place where time didn't exist, where nothing else mattered except this quiet connection that pulsed between us. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the landscape, he reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm, a silent promise that whatever this was, it was real. And in that moment, I knew that this was something I wanted, something I was willing to explore no matter where it led. The peace didn't last. As we drove back, reality began to creep in. The weight of what had happened settled over me, filling me with a mix of excitement and doubt. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something we couldn't ignore, but I also knew that it wasn't going to be easy. Over the next few days, We tried to act as if nothing had changed, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every touch felt loaded, a reminder of the kiss we'd shared, the silent promise that hung between us. I could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at me, a mix of longing and hesitation that mirrored my own. One evening, as we sat in the shed working on one of his projects, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Are you okay with this?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, his eyes searching mine. I nodded, though my heart was pounding, a mix of excitement and nerves that left me breathless. "I am," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. I didn't expect it to feel this way." He smiled, a soft, almost sad smile that seemed to carry 1,000 unspoken words. "Neither did I," he admitted, his voice tinged with a vulnerability that felt both comforting and unnerving. "But sometimes things just happen." We sat there in silence, the weight of his words hanging in the air, a silent acknowledgement that this was something neither of us had planned, but something we couldn't ignore. It was like we were standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if we would fall or fly, caught between fear and exhilaration. The unknown stretched out before us. And yet, despite the uncertainty, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet understanding that this was something I wanted to explore, something that felt right, even if I couldn't explain it. We'd crossed a line, but instead of feeling lost, I felt like I'd found something real, something that was worth the risk. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered conversations, a quiet exploration of this new connection that had blossomed between us. We were careful, always on edge, but somehow, the thrill of it all made it feel even more real, like we were sharing a secret world that no one else could touch. One afternoon, as we sat by the lake, watching the sunlight dance on the water, he reached for my hand, his touch gentle but sure. I looked at him, a question in my eyes, and he just smiled, a soft, reassuring smile that made everything feel okay, like this was something we could hold on to, something that could withstand the weight of the world around us. In that moment, I felt a sense of clarity, a quiet certainty that this was something I wanted, something that felt worth fighting for. The fear and uncertainty melted away, replaced by a quiet confidence, a sense that we were in this together, no matter where it led. We'd cross a line, but instead of feeling lost, I felt like I'd found something real, something that was worth every risk, every fear, every moment of doubt. As I looked at him, I knew that we were standing on the edge of something incredible, a journey that would take us to places we'd never imagined, a story that was just beginning to unfold. The following days felt like living on a tightrope, balanced between excitement and the looming reality of what lay ahead. We spent every free moment together, each day uncovering new layers, little pieces of each other that we'd only started to explore. There was something thrilling about it all, this shared secret, this quiet connection that seemed to deepen with every glance, every touch, every whispered word. Yet with each passing day, the question of where we were headed lingered like a shadow, a weight pressing on the edges of our time together. One evening, he suggested we take a walk, something we often did, but there was a different energy about him that night. The air felt charged, like a storm was brewing, and I sensed that this walk would be unlike the others, that something was waiting for us at the end of it. We left the house and headed down the familiar path toward the lake, the only sound our footsteps on the gravel, our breaths steady yet heavy with anticipation. As we reached the water's edge, he stopped, turning to look out at the lake, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between us, and I felt my heart pounding, a mix of fear and hope, knowing that something was about to change. After a moment, he looked at me, his gaze intense, his eyes holding a depth that made my chest ache. "I don't want to lose this," he said quietly, his voice laced with a vulnerability I'd never heard before. "But I know that it can't last, not like this." The words hung in the air, raw and painful, and I felt a pang of something I hadn't let myself acknowledge before, a fear of losing him, of this ending before it had truly begun. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, searching for the right words, something to bridge the distance that seemed to be growing between us. "We don't have to know everything right now," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. "We could take it one day at a time." He nodded, a small, sad smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But what happens when the days run out? When we have to face reality?" I looked away, feeling the weight of his words settle over me, pressing down on the fragile hope I'd held on to. It was a question I didn't have an answer for, a truth I wasn't ready to face. But as I looked back at him, seeing the pain in his eyes, I realized that avoiding it wouldn't change anything. Sooner or later, we'd have to confront the limits of what we could be. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and honesty. "But I'd rather have this, whatever it is, than regret not trying." He sighed, reaching out to take my hand, his touch warm and steady, grounding me in the moment. We stood there in silence, the weight of our feelings unspoken yet clear, a shared understanding that while we might not have the answers, we had each other, if only for a little while. As the night wore on, we sat by the water, talking about everything and nothing, letting the hours slip by like the gentle waves that lapped at the shore. It was a quiet kind of peace, a calm that felt both comforting and bittersweet, a reminder of the fleeting nature of the time we had together. And as the sky began to lighten, a soft glow on the horizon signaling the approaching dawn, I felt a sense of clarity, a quiet acceptance that while our path might be uncertain, it was worth every risk, every fear. In the days that followed, we fell into a rhythm, an unspoken agreement to live in the present, to cherish each moment as it came without questioning the future. We spent our afternoons in the shed, working on projects and sharing stories, losing ourselves in the simplicity of our time together. It was as if we'd created our own little world, a place where nothing else mattered, where we could be ourselves, free from the weight of expectations and fears. But even as we held on to this shared world, I could feel the edges beginning to fray, the reality of our lives creeping in, a reminder that this couldn't last forever. There were moments when I'd catch him looking at me, a hint of sadness in his eyes, as if he too felt the inevitable pull of the outside world, the forces that would eventually draw us apart. One afternoon, as we sat in the shed, the quiet ticking of the clock marking the passing time, he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder what would happen if things were different?" he asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant, as if he were afraid of the answer. I looked at him, feeling a pang of sadness mixed with hope. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But I try not to think about it too much. I'd rather focus on what we have right here, right now." He nodded, a small, wistful smile playing on his lips. "Me too," he replied, his gaze drifting to the window, as if he were searching for something just beyond reach. "But it's hard, isn't it? Knowing that no matter how much we want it, there are things we can't change." I reached out, placing my hand over his, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady beat of his pulse beneath my fingers. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a promise, a silent acknowledgement that while our time together might be finite, it was real, and that was enough. I felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that while we couldn't control the future, we could choose how we spent the present. And in that moment, I knew that I would always carry this time with me, a memory that would stay with me long after the days had faded, a reminder of a connection that went beyond words, beyond time. The next morning, as we sat on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the world come to life, I felt a sense of gratitude, quiet joy in the simple moments we shared. It was a feeling I'd come to cherish, a reminder of the beauty in the everyday, the magic of being fully present with someone who understood me in ways I hadn't thought possible. But as the day wore on, I could sense a shift, a subtle change in the air, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. I looked at him, seeing the same realization in his eyes, a silent understanding that our time together was coming to an end. As the days slipped by, the distance between us grew, a quiet space that neither of us dared to cross, a reminder that while our connection was real, it was bound by the limits of time, a fleeting bond that would eventually fade. But even as we drifted apart, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that while our story might be ending, it would live on in my heart, a memory that would stay with me, a reminder of a love that was both beautiful and bittersweet. And as I watched him walk away, a part of me felt a sense of loss, a quiet ache that lingered in the empty space he'd left behind. But even as the pain settled over me, I felt a sense of gratitude, a quiet joy in the knowledge that I'd had the chance to experience something real, something that had touched my life in ways I couldn't fully explain. In the end, our story became a collection of moments, each one small, but woven together into a memory that would forever linger in my heart. There was no need for grand gestures or explanations. The connection we shared was enough. As I looked out at the horizon, watching the colors fade into dusk, I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that we had embraced something rare and real, even if only for a brief time. Though our paths had diverged, the warmth of that connection remained, a quiet presence that would always remind me of that summer. If you were moved by this story, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more emotional, romantic, and heart-wrenching tales from the LGBT community. Don't forget to leave a comment below and share your thoughts on this story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.